The night had deepened further, and the inn had grown quieter as the few remaining guests had drifted off to their rooms. The soft crackle of the fire in the hearth was the only sound besides the occasional drip of water from the eaves outside. Luke and Clara remained at their table, the candle between them flickering gently, casting long dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Time had begun to feel unimportant. Outside, the town streets lay empty and glistening, reflecting the faint glow of the moon. Inside, however, the world had narrowed to the two of them. Sitting together in a small, warm bubble of light and conversation, Clara leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes following the movements of the candle flame. "I never realized how much I needed this," she said softly. "A night like this? Just talking. Feeling like someone actually hears me." Her voice was quiet, but it carried an unspoken weight. A relief from months of holding things inside. Luke nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen. It doesn't fix everything, but it makes the weight a little easier to bear." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I think that's why I stayed tonight. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because it felt like the right thing to do." Clara turned her eyes to him, meeting his gaze directly. For the first time that night, there was a quiet honesty in the way they looked at each other. No pretense, no small talk, just two people sharing a moment of understanding. "You've made the night easier for me," she admitted. "Not just by staying, but by being yourself, honest, real." Luke's lips curved into a small smile. "It's strange," he said. "I've spent so many nights alone on the road, thinking I didn't need anyone. But tonight feels different. It feels like maybe being here, just being present, is enough." Ow. The candle flickered, and for a moment, its light seemed to waver, as if reflecting the fragile balance of the night. Outside, a soft breeze rustled the trees, sending the faint scent of rain and earth through the open window. Luke could see the quiet exhaustion in Clara's eyes, the subtle lines of worry that softened only when she smiled. He realized then that she had been carrying the weight of loneliness for longer than she let on, and that his presence even for a single night had given her a small reprieve from that. Burdened, Clara set her cup down and leaned forward slightly. "Do you ever wonder if people meet each other for a reason?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. "Not in a mystical way, just in a way that makes a moment feel meant to happen." Luke considered this, resting his chin lightly on his hand. "I do," he said slowly. "Sometimes the people we meet, even for a short time, change the way we see the world. Even if it's just for a single night, it can leave a mark we carry with us." Clara smiled faintly, a small glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Maybe that's what tonight is," she said softly. "A moment that matters, even if it doesn't last forever." Luke nodded, understanding completely. "Even if it doesn't last forever, it's still worth having," he said. "Even small moments can mean more than we think." The conversation slowed, both of them letting the quiet fill the space between words. The fire had burned lower now, casting a softer, warmer glow across the room. The candlelight flickered as if in agreement, creating shadows that danced lightly across the wooden walls. Luke noticed how the shadows seemed to follow Clara's movements, bending and stretching as she shifted slightly in her chair. There was a beauty in the simplicity of it, the quiet, unspoken companionship that had grown between them over the hours. Clara glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the late hour. "I guess it's getting close to morning," she said quietly. "The night has flown by." Luke nodded, though he felt no desire for it to end. "Time moves fast when you're not paying attention," he said. "Especially when you're with someone who makes the night feel lighter." Clara smiled, her expression softening. "I don't want it to end," she admitted. "Not yet. Not while it feels like this." Her voice trailed off, leaving the word unspoken, but Luke understood. She meant the quiet peace, the understanding, the warmth of companionship that had grown between them. Luke reached out, this time letting his hand rest gently on the table closer to hers, without touching. "Then we don't have to end it yet," he said softly. "We can stay a little longer. No need to rush." For a long while, they simply sat together, listening to the fire, the faint sounds of the town outside, and the soft breathing of each other. The silence was comforting, not empty. It was filled with the understanding that neither was truly alone, even in the vast, quiet world beyond the inn's walls. Eventually, Clara spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've always wondered what it would be like to have someone care enough to just stay, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't make sense." Luke looked at her steadily. Sometimes people stay not because it makes sense, but because it feels right. Because being there for someone, even for a short while, can make all the difference. Clara nodded slowly, a faint smile on her lips. "You make it sound so simple," she said. "But it's not. Most people, they leave. Or they don't notice. Or they don't care." Luke shook his head gently. "Not everyone," he said. "Some people do notice. Some people care. And sometimes, those people find you when you least expect it." The candle burned lower, its flame flickering softly, casting golden light across their faces. Luke noticed the small gestures that had grown between them, the way Clara's hands moved when she spoke, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed quietly at something he said, the subtle nods and expressions that communicated more than words ever could. There was a rhythm to their companionship, a silent understanding that didn't need explanation. Hours passed, and the inn grew quieter still. The fire in the hearth was now little more than glowing embers, sending occasional sparks into the air. Luke and Clara remained, sitting close enough to feel each other's presence, yet respecting the quiet space that had developed between them. It was a delicate balance, a dance of unspoken emotions and shared understanding. Finally, Clara let out a soft sigh, leaning back in her chair. I think I needed this more than I realized," she admitted. "Not just the company, but the understanding. The feeling that someone really sees you." Luke nodded, feeling the same truth for himself. "I understand," he said softly. "Sometimes all it takes is one night, one conversation to remind you that there's still kindness in the world. That connection is possible, even when it seems far away." Clara's eyes met his, and in that quiet gaze, there was a moment of recognition, a shared understanding of the fleeting yet powerful connection they had formed. "Thank you," she whispered, "for staying, for listening, for being here." Luke felt a warmth spread through him at her words, a quiet satisfaction that he had made a difference in someone's life, even for a single night. "It's been my honor," he replied, "and I'm glad I stayed." The night continued to stretch on, the fire now completely gone, leaving only the soft glow of the candlelight. Luke and Clara remained, wrapped in the quiet companionship that had grown between them over the hours. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations, just the simple, honest presence of one person for another. As the first hints of dawn began to appear, soft streaks of pale light touching the inn's windows, Clara leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand. "I'll never forget this night," she said softly. "Not just because of what we talked about, but because you stayed. You didn't leave." Luke smiled, feeling the weight of the night settle into something lasting. "Neither will I," he said. "Some nights, they leave a mark, even if they're brief. This night will stay with me." For a long while, they sat in quiet reflection, watching the first light of morning creep across the wooden floorboards, feeling the comfort and peace of shared presence. It was a night that had begun with rain, solitude, and quiet longing, and had transformed into a memory of understanding, warmth, and connection, even as the world outside began to wake. Luke and Clara remained, savoring the fragile, beautiful bond that had formed between them. The night had been long, and the candles had burned down, but the comfort and companionship they had found in each other endured. Quiet but strong, a reminder that even in fleeting moments, human connection could shine brighter than any candle. The night outside the inn had grown deeper, and the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the faint moonlight that broke through the clouds. The world beyond the inn seemed quiet, almost hushed, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the soft glow of the candle on their table created a small island of comfort, a place removed from the rest of the town, removed even from the passage of time. Luke and Clara sat opposite each other, leaning just slightly forward. Their chairs pulled close enough to share warmth, but not so close as to feel crowded. The conversation had shifted now, moving beyond the light stories and laughter that had filled the earlier hours. There was a quiet depth between them, a willingness to speak honestly and openly, to reveal truths that were often kept hidden from strangers. Clara set her cup down gently, her fingers lingering on the edge of the porcelain. "Do you ever think about regrets?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Things we did, or didn't do." Luke looked down at his own hands resting on the table, the lines and calluses telling stories of hard work, long days and nights spent under the open sky. "I think about them sometimes," he admitted. "Mostly the things I didn't do, the chances I didn't take. But I try not to dwell. Regret can be heavy, and it doesn't help to carry it alone." Clara nodded slowly, understanding his meaning more than she could express. "I feel that way sometimes," she whispered. "There are choices I didn't make, people I didn't reach out to, moments I let pass. And then there are nights like this, where the weight of it all feels heavier, and I can't help but wonder if it will always be this way." Luke's eyes softened as he studied her face. There was a quiet strength in her, even beneath the vulnerability she carried. "It won't always be this way," he said. "Some nights are heavier, yes, but that doesn't mean they last forever. Life has a way of changing, slowly, quietly. And sometimes, people come along who make those heavy nights a little lighter." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "And you think that can happen?" she asked, almost daring to believe. "I do," Luke replied simply. "Sometimes you meet someone, even for a short while. It reminds you that there's more than just the weight of yesterday, that there's laughter and warmth and quiet moments that matter." They fell silent after that, the words lingering between them like a gentle breeze. Clara traced patterns on the table with her finger, the candlelight reflecting off the polished wood. Luke watched her carefully, noticing how she seemed both fragile and strong at the same time, like a flower that had survived a storm and still bloomed. He could feel the pull of something he hadn't felt in years, a connection, genuine and rare, that made the long nights on the road suddenly seem less lonely. "I've always wondered," Clara said after a while, her voice almost a whisper, "what it would be like to trust someone completely. To let them see all the pieces of you, even the parts you hide from everyone else." Luke's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. "It's not easy," he said. "Trust takes time, and it takes courage. But when it's right, it's worth it. Worth the risk." Clara let out a small sigh, a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I want that," she admitted softly. "I want to believe it's possible. But I'm scared too." Luke reached out, his hand hovering just above hers for a moment before he rested it gently on the edge of the table. Not touching, not forcing anything, just presence, just reassurance. "Being scared doesn't mean you won't find it," he said. "It just means you're human. And being human, that's part of the journey." For a long time, they sat like that, two souls quietly acknowledging their fears, their hopes, and the fragility of life. The fire crackled, the candle flickered, and the world outside the inn continued its slow, steady rhythm. There was no rush, no expectation, only the quiet understanding that, for this night, they were not alone. As the hours passed, the conversation turned to their dreams. Clara spoke of small things she wished for: a garden filled with flowers, a home where laughter could echo, a life that felt safe and steady. Luke shared his own dreams, simple yet profound, to find a place where he could rest without leaving. To experience the comfort of a life shared with someone who understood the road he had traveled. There was a tenderness in their exchange, a sense that even in the smallest confessions, trust was growing. Luke realized that he had not felt this close to anyone in years. The long, lonely nights of traveling had left him wary of attachments. Yet here was someone who made the thought of staying, even for a single night, feel natural and right. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. "It's strange," she said softly, "how sometimes the smallest gestures, a kind word, a listening ear, can make such a difference. Tonight, just having you here, It's made me feel lighter than I have in months. Luke nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes all it takes, he said, is someone willing to stay, even when it's hard. Even when the night is long and the world feels heavy, Clara's smile deepened, the kind that reached her eyes and warmed her entire face. "I'm glad you stayed," she said simply. Her voice filled with quiet gratitude. Luke felt a warmth spread through him at her words. He had not expected this night to mean so much. Not when he had walked in expecting only warmth and shelter from the rain. Yet here he was, sharing stories, fears, and dreams with someone who seemed to understand without judgment. The connection was unspoken, yet powerful, a bond formed in the gentle quiet of a long, reflective night. As the fire burned lower, Luke and Clara grew more comfortable in the silence between words. It was a companionable silence, the kind that only develops when two people feel safe enough to simply be. They listened to the soft sounds of the creak of the floorboards, the occasional drip of water from the eaves, the quiet rustle of the wind outside. Each sound seemed magnified in the quiet night, yet none of it disturbed the peace that had settled over them. At one point, Clara leaned back, her eyes half closed, watching the candle flame dance. "I feel like I can tell you anything," she murmured. "Like you'd understand even the things I don't say out loud." Luke met her gaze steadily. "You can," he said. "I'll listen. And I won't judge. Everyone carries their own burdens. Sharing them, it doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Clara let out a small laugh, soft and almost shy. "You make it sound so easy," she said. "But I think maybe it is with the right person." Luke smiled faintly. "It's not easy," he admitted. "But when it's real, it's worth it. Every moment." The hours slipped by unnoticed, the fire casting long shadows across the walls, the candlelight flickering in quiet rhythm with their breathing. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to appear, soft streaks of pale light pushing through the clouds. Inside, Luke and Clara remained, talking, listening, and simply being present for one another. As the morning approached, Clara sighed softly. A mixture of contentment and the fatigue that comes from a long night of honest conversation. "I never thought a night could feel like this," she said quietly. "So full, yet peaceful." Luke nodded, understanding completely. "Sometimes the quietest nights leave the biggest marks," he said. "Even when we think we're alone, we find people who make the silence feel lighter." For the first time in a long while, both of them felt a sense of hope. Hope that even in the loneliness of their separate lives, there could be moments like this, moments of understanding, warmth, and human connection. And as the first light of day touched the inn, they knew that, no matter what the future held, this night would remain a memory they could carry with them forever. Night when two strangers shared their hearts, their fears and their dreams, finding comfort in the simple act of being together. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, sending warm sparks flickering into the dimly lit inn. Outside, the rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, tapping lightly against the window panes. The room seemed to shrink around Luke and Clara. The empty space filled with the subtle sounds of the creak of wooden floorboards, the occasional shuffle of a broom from the innkeeper tidying the corner, and the soft drip of water from the eaves outside. Luke leaned back in his chair, resting his arms on the table, while Clara held her teacup close, as if the warmth could chase away the shadows that lingered in her thoughts. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not awkward. It was comfortable, like the pause between two notes in a song, both waiting for the other to continue. Luke observed Clara carefully. Her eyes, dark and thoughtful, seemed to be watching the rain more than him, yet he could sense her awareness of his presence. The candlelight danced across her face, highlighting the softness of her features. And he noticed the faint lines around her eye signs of laughter, of worry, of a life that had not always been easy. There was honesty in her expression, a vulnerability that didn't ask for pity but invited connection. Finally she spoke, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "You ever wonder," she began slowly, "why some nights feel heavier than others?" Luke raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the question. "Heavier?" He asked. "Yes," Clara said, tracing a finger along the rim of her cup. Like the world is too big, and everything you've done, all the places you've been, all the people you've met, it doesn't matter. You just feel small. She paused, staring into her tea, as if searching for the right words. Some nights, that smallness hits harder than others. Luke nodded slowly. He knew the feeling well, a kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from realizing that no one truly understands you. I get that, he said. I've spent a lot of nights on the road. You get used to being alone, sure, but it still hits you sometimes. Even the wide-open plains can feel empty. Claire looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time since the conversation began. There was something in his gaze, steady and calm, that made her feel safe. As if speaking aloud, her thoughts wouldn't make her weak or foolish. I've tried not to let it bother me, she admitted, but some nights, it's hard not to think about it. About being alone forever. Luke's hand unconsciously rested on the table, close but not touching hers. He felt a strange warmth in the simple act of being near her, a feeling that had been absent from his life for a long time. You're not alone tonight, he said softly. I'm here. If you want, I'll stay. Clara's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. You would? She asked, a hint of surprise in her voice. She seemed almost unsure if anyone would actually respond to such an honest request. I would, Luke said simply. It's just tonight. We don't have to talk if you don't want to. We can just be here. The simplicity of his offer seemed to settle something inside Clara. She leaned back slightly, letting out a small breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. I'd like that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The rain continued its gentle rhythm outside, and the world beyond the inn seemed to fade. Time slowed, and the two of them sat together, sharing the quiet without needing to fill it with words. Luke could hear the faint sound of her heartbeat, steady and calm, and it reminded him of the nights he had spent alone under the stars, longing for some small connection, some warmth in the vast emptiness. He realized, with a quiet surprise, that he had found it here, in this small inn, sitting across from a woman who didn't even know his name until tonight. After a while, Clara spoke again, her voice softer this time, more contemplative. Do you ever regret being a cowboy? She asked. Traveling all the time? Never staying in one place? Luke thought for a moment, tracing a finger along the rim of his coffee cup. Sometimes, he admitted. The road gives you freedom, sure, but it also gives you distance. Distance from people, from towns, from life that's permanent. You see a lot, you experience a lot, but you're always moving. You're never really part of anything. Clara nodded slowly, understanding more than she could say. I think that's why I stay here, she murmured. I don't move, not really. I like the familiarity, the predictability. But sometimes, it makes the nights longer and the silence louder. Luke considered her words. He had spent most of his life moving, yet there was a comfort in someone who stayed, someone who had roots in a place, even if it meant facing their own loneliness at night. Maybe that's why we're here together tonight, he said, a small smile forming. Because even people with different lives can understand each other when they really need to. Clara returned his smile, faint but genuine. Maybe, she said, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear completely. The rain, the distant sounds of the town, even the innkeeper in the corner, all of it faded into a quiet background to the small, glowing bubble of connection between them as the night deepened. The conversation drifted into lighter topics. They spoke of simple pleasures, a favorite meal, a memory from childhood, a book or song that had stayed with them. Clara told stories of the town she had grown up in, of summer days spent by the river, of winters huddled around fires with family. Luke shared tales from his travels of sunsets over the plains, rivers that ran like silver threads through the land, and the quiet beauty of small towns that only lasted a few days in his memory before he moved on. There were moments of laughter too, small chuckles that grew into genuine smiles. As they shared absurd situations and funny mistakes from their past, each story, each laugh, slowly built a bridge between them, connecting to lives that had been separate until now. At one point, Clara tilted her head and asked, Do you think people can really change? Or do we just move from one version of ourselves to another? Luke considered this for a long moment. I think people can change, he said carefully. Not all at once, and not without effort. But sometimes, just being around the right person, even for a short time, can make a difference. It can remind you who you are or who you want to be. Clara looked at him, studying his face. There was honesty in his words, a truth that resonated deeply within her. Maybe that's what tonight is, she whispered. A reminder that we're not always alone, even when it feels that way. Luke nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction in her words. The candles flickered between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And the fire in the hearth sent warmth across the room. The inn felt alive in a gentle, comforting way. Not because of the people or the light, but because of the connection that had quietly formed between them. Hours passed, and still neither wanted to break the fragile bond. Luke could see the fatigue in Clara's eyes, the subtle signs of weariness that came from nights spent feeling alone. You should rest soon, he said gently. It's been a long night, and the morning will come before we know it. Clara shook her head, smiling faintly. Not yet, she replied. I like having you here. It makes the night easier to bear. Luke felt a quiet pride in that simple statement. It was not a request, nor a demand. It was gratitude, pure and unspoken. He leaned back in his chair, content to simply sit with her, letting the hours slip by without concern for the world outside. The rain continued its soft whisper, the fire crackled in the hearth, and the candlelight danced between them, marking the passage of time in a way that felt both eternal and fleeting. By the time the innkeeper began extinguishing the lamps and tidying the tables, Luke realized the night had grown long, but neither of them seemed to notice. They had found in each other a rare kind of companionship, a moment of understanding and warmth that made the world feel smaller, softer, and more welcoming. As the final hours of the night stretched onward, Luke made a quiet promise to himself. No matter how far he would travel, no matter how lonely the road might get, he would carry the memory of this night with him, a night where two strangers had found comfort in the simplest of truths, that sometimes being present, simply being there, was enough to make the world feel less lonely. The rain had been falling softly for most of the evening, washing the dirt streets of the small western town with a gentle rhythm. It wasn't the kind of rain that soaked through clothes instantly, but enough to make the wooden planks of the boardwalk slick and dark. The few lamps lining the street cast warm, golden glows, flickering slightly with the wind that drifted through the alleyways. In the quiet that only a slow, rainy night could bring, Luke rode his horse at a steady pace, his boots snug in the stirrups and his coat pulled tightly around his shoulders. The cowboy had been traveling for weeks, moving from one town to the next, never staying long enough for people to notice him or for trouble to find him. He was used to the solitude, the long hours under the sky, the sound of his horse's hooves against the earth, the creak of leather and the whisper of the wind. Yet tonight, something in the stillness made him feel a little out of place, like he didn't quite belong anywhere. Given in the towns he'd wandered through so many times before, Luke guided his horse toward the inn at the edge of town, a place he had passed many times but never entered. The inn sign swung gently in the rain, the wooden letters worn but still legible, the lantern's glow. The windows were fogged over with moisture, and through them he could see faint movement shadows of people sitting, drinking and talking. Luke's horse snorted softly, as if it too was wary of the new place. Taking a deep breath, Luke dismounted, tightened the reins, and led the horse to the hitching post, tying it carefully. He ran a hand over his face, brushing away the rainwater that clung to his hair and stubble. Inside, the inn smelled warm and faintly of wood smoke and baked bread, comforting after the damp chill outside. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the light danced across the wooden beams of the ceiling. There were only a handful of people sitting at tables, and the quiet chatter was punctuated by the occasional clinking of glasses. Luke's boots thumped against the wooden floor as he walked to the counter, where the innkeeper, a kindly older man with a gray beard, looked up and nodded. Evenin'. Stranger, the innkeeper said, his voice soft but friendly. Weather's a bit rough tonight, huh? "Evening," Luke replied, his voice calm and low. "It's nothing I can't handle," innkeeper chuckled, shaking his head. "That may be, but it's a good night to come in and warm up. Got some rooms if you're looking to stay?" Luke nodded, glancing around the room. Something caught his eye immediately, a woman sitting alone by a small table near the window. She had a soft, gentle presence, the kind that drew attention without her asking for it. She was sipping tea, her fingers wrapped around the warm cup, her gaze focused on the rain outside. Her hair, dark and glossy, clung to her cheeks in a few strands dampened by the rain. Soft and thoughtful, seemed to hold stories Luke couldn't begin to guess. There was a sadness in her expression, subtle but unmistakable. A quiet loneliness that resonated with something deep inside him. Luke moved to the counter and asked for a room, keeping one eye on the woman. As the innkeeper prepared the key, Luke couldn't help but wonder about her. There was something in the way she held herself, the slight slump of her shoulders that told him she was carrying burdens no one else in the room could see. He didn't usually notice people like this, not strangers he passed, in towns he barely stayed in. But something about tonight, and maybe the rain, or the quiet of the inn made him pause. The innkeeper handed him the key, and Luke turned toward the door leading to the stairs. Before he went upstairs, he made his way toward the woman's table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked gently. She looked up, startled, but there was no fear in her eyes. Instead, a small, tentative smile appeared. "Not at all," she said softly. Her voice was quiet, yet there was a warmth to it that made Luke feel unexpectedly at ease. He pulled out a chair and sat opposite her. For a moment, they didn't speak, just watched the rain trace paths down the glass, each droplet catching the flicker of candlelight from the table. Then, she spoke again, a little more relaxed. "It's nights like this that make you think you know." Luke nodded slowly. "Think about what?" he asked, curious. "About being alone," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the cup. "Some nights it's worse than others. You sit by yourself, and the world feels bigger than it really is." Luke was silent for a moment, considering her words. He knew that feeling all too well, the ache of solitude, the endless horizon of silence after a long day. "I get that," he said finally. "I've spent a lot of nights on the road. It's quiet, mostly, but sometimes it's lonely too." A small laugh escaped her, soft and genuine, though tinged with melancholy. "You'd think someone like a cowboy, traveling all the time, would be used to it. But even we get tired of empty rooms and quiet nights." Luke studied her, noticing the honesty in her voice, the lack of pretense. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't fishing for company. She was simply stating a truth that she had learned to live with. Yet somehow, it reached him differently. It wasn't a complaint, it was an invitation, subtle and unspoken, for someone to be there. Even for a little while. "Name's Luke," he said after a moment, offering a hand across the table. "And you are?" "Clara," she replied, shaking his hand lightly. Her grip was warm and reassuring. "Clara Benson." The rain outside continued to tap against the window, steady and rhythmic. Luke found himself lingering in the moment, not wanting to break the quiet connection that had begun to form. He noticed the flickering candles on the table, casting soft shadows across her face, highlighting the lines of thought and concern that softened whenever she smiled. She seemed fragile, yet there was a quiet strength in her, something that made him trust her without fully understanding why. As the night grew darker, the inn emptied slowly. Luke ordered a cup of coffee, and Clara's tea was refilled by the attentive innkeeper. They began talking, cautiously at first, about small things: the weather, the town, the people who ran the inn. But soon, the conversation drifted into deeper territory. Clara spoke of the town she had grown up in, of family and friends who were far away, and of the small moments that made her life feel both lonely and beautiful. Luke shared stories of the roads he had traveled, of sunsets over wide plains, of nights under endless stars, and of the quiet freedom of a life spent moving rather than staying. Neither of them realized how much time had passed. The fire in the hearth had burned lower, casting a warmer, softer glow over the room. The few remaining patrons had left, and the innkeeper was tidying up behind the counter. The sound of the rain against the windows was now the dominant background, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Clara glanced at the candle, its flame dancing like a tiny sun. "I don't want to wake up alone tonight," she said, almost whispering, a hint of vulnerability breaking through her calm demeanor. It wasn't a demand, nor a plight. It was simply a truth. A quiet confession to the man sitting across from her. Luke looked at her, and for a moment, he didn't speak. He had spent so many nights alone, so many evenings where his only company was the whisper of the wind or the neigh of his horse, and yet here was someone who needed nothing from him but his presence. The decision came quietly, naturally. "Then I'll stay," he said simply, his voice steady, "until the candles burn out." Clara's eyes widened slightly, surprised by his answer, but relief softened her expression. There was no awkwardness, no expectation, just the knowledge that, for this one night, neither of them would have to face the quiet alone. Luke leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his coffee while Clara settled more comfortably in her seat. The rain continued its gentle rhythm outside. The fire flickered in the hearth, and the candles danced, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. And in that quiet, simple moment, two people found a small measure of peace and companionship, a rare connection in a world that often felt vast and empty. The first light of morning filtered through the windows of the inn, soft and pale, painting the wooden floorboards in gentle streaks of gold. Outside, the rain had long since stopped, leaving the streets of the small town glistening in the early sun. The world seemed quiet, almost serene, as though it too recognized the significance of the night that had passed. Inside, Luke and Clara remained seated at their table. The small remnants of candle wax pooled around the base where the flames had long since died. The fire in the hearth had gone out entirely, leaving the room bathed in the natural light of dawn. Luke sipped the last of his coffee, savoring the warmth that had accompanied him through the long night. He looked at Clara, who had finally leaned back in her chair, eyes soft and calm, a faint smile on her lips. There was a lightness in her expression, a subtle release from the weight of loneliness she had carried before tonight. Luke realized then how rare these moments were, how precious it was to simply be present for someone, and how quietly transformative one night could be. "You'll have to leave soon," Clara said softly, almost reluctantly, as if speaking the words made them more real. "The morning is here, and you've been here, well, longer than expected." Luke nodded, understanding the reality of the day outside, but feeling a strange reluctance to break the spell of the night. "I know," he said quietly, "but it doesn't make it any easier." Clara's gaze softened, and she reached across the table, lightly touching his hand, not forcefully, but gently, a gesture of warmth and gratitude. "I'm glad you stayed," she said simply. "Not just because of the night, but because you were here when I needed someone, and that matters more than I can say." Luke felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words, a quiet satisfaction that came from being exactly where he was needed. "It matters to me too," he replied. "Even if the night is over, the memory will stay. And sometimes, that's enough." They sat in silence for a few moments, neither needing to speak. The world outside the inn had begun to stir, the faint sounds of footsteps on the boardwalk, the creak of shutters being opened, the distant neigh of a horse somewhere down the street, but inside, there was a lingering peace. The night had ended, but the connection remained delicate and enduring. Finally, Luke stood, stretching slightly after hours of sitting. He glanced at Clara, her eyes following his movements. "I should go," he said, his voice soft. "The road calls, as it always does. But I won't forget tonight, and I hope neither will you." Clara stood as well, her expression a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "I won't forget," she said firmly. "Not a word, not a gesture. You've made the night brighter than I ever imagined." She paused, searching for the right words, then added, "And I hope the road treats you well, wherever it leads." Luke smiled, a quiet, genuine smile. "It will," he said, "because tonight reminded me that even on the road, there are moments worth remembering, people worth remembering." He moved toward the door, and Clara followed to the edge of the room. The inn felt warmer somehow, as if it had absorbed the companionship and trust that had grown over the hours. Luke paused at the door, glancing back at her one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said simply, "and don't let the weight of the world keep you from finding these moments again. They're out there, waiting." Clara nodded, a small smile on her lips, her eyes glistening with the quiet emotion of the night. "I'll try," she said. "And you, take care of yourself too." Luke stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against his face. The streets were slick from the rain, shimmering under the pale sunlight, and his horse whinnied softly as he approached. He ran a hand along the mane, feeling the familiar warmth and strength of the animal that had carried him through countless miles. Mounting with ease, he glanced back at the inn one last time, where Clara stood in the doorway, watching him silently. The distance between them felt vast, yet the bond of the night bridged it in a way that words could not. As Luke rode away, the town slowly waking behind him, he thought about the conversations, the laughter, and the moments of quiet understanding they had shared. There was a peace that came from knowing he had made a difference, even for a single night in someone's life. And he carried that peace with him. It's like a lantern lighting the way along the lonely road. Clara remained in the doorway long after he had disappeared from sight, her eyes tracing the path he had taken. She felt a mixture of longing and gratitude, a quiet understanding that some people enter your life not to stay forever, but to leave an imprint that changes the way you see the world. The night had been brief, but the impact was enduring. She closed the door gently, carrying the warmth of the night inside her heart. Over the next days, life resumed its normal rhythm. Clara returned to her daily routines, tending to the small tasks that filled her life, but something had shifted. The quiet loneliness that had weighed on her felt lighter now, as if the night's companionship had left a mark she could carry with her. She found herself smiling at small things, noticing the beauty in ordinary moments, and recalling the honesty and warmth of Luke's presence. Luke, too, felt the change as he continued along the roads he traveled. The memory of the inn, the flickering candles, and Clara's calm strength remained with him. It reminded him that even in a life of movement and solitude, moments of connection could transform the hardest nights into something meaningful. He thought of her smile, her quiet words, and the trust she had shown, and it encouraged him to continue seeking the small, precious connections that made the road worthwhile. Weeks later, both would recall that night with a gentle fondness. They never expected to meet again, and perhaps they never would. Yet the memory remained vivid. The firelight, the candles' glow, the rain on the streets, and the feeling of being understood, truly understood, by another person. It became a story they could return to, a night when loneliness was softened by companionship, when quiet fears were met with presence and care, and when two strangers shared a fleeting yet unforgettable bond, even as the seasons changed. The memory of that night stayed with them. Clara would sometimes look at the window of the inn where the candle had burned, thinking of Luke and the quiet comfort he had offered. Luke, on the road beneath the endless sky, would recall the warmth of the inn, the quiet laughter, and the sincerity of a woman who had let him be part of her night. The memory was a reminder that human connection, no matter how brief, could illuminate even the darkest hours. In the end, the story of that night was not about love in its traditional form, nor about promises of forever. It was about presence, about listening, about staying when it would have been easier to leave. It was about two people recognizing each other's humanity and finding solace in it. It was about how a single night, spent in understanding and quiet companionship, could leave a lasting impact, reminding them both that even in solitude, they were not truly alone, and so life continued one on the road. One in the town, but both carried with them a small, enduring flame of warmth. A memory of a night when candles burned low, hearts opened, and strangers became companions for a brief, unforgettable time.